Okay, I want to talk about a very old movie. It's a Japanese movie, and the Japanese title is Matango, and it's usually translated into the English Attack of the Killer Mushroom People, so it's got this crazy title. And I call it a survival movie because I believe it has all the elements which could be encountered in a realistic situation. So let's talk about that. So I want to step you through the movie and explain why I think it's a great movie about survival, and we'll ignore the preposterous sci-fi horror aspect of the whole thing. Alright, so what's this about? It's about a group of 7 people, and that group of people consists of a rich businessman. This is the guy who owns this yacht, his mistress, who happens to be a singer, and a bit of a bimbo, really, a professional sailor, and this guy is also supposed to be the businessman's friend, and he's been hired as the ship's captain. There's a university professor of psychology, a university clerk, who's a bit of a weakling in the whole story, the first mate, and a writer friend of the businessman. So they all set sail in the ocean to somewhere in southern Japanese waters, encountering a violent storm of which they are not prepared, as none of them are sailors except the captain. They foolishly decide not to return to the mainland before things get out of hand, because they encounter this serious storm, and they decide, that's probably their first mistake, they decide because of egos and no one prepared to say we should return, they decide not to return, and they decide to keep going wherever they're going to. Yeah, so egos are getting out of hand. That's their first mistake. So what happens is the boat becomes flooded during the storm, and the radio is destroyed while they're trying to send an SOS message in Morse code. Yeah, because they forget to close the hatch of the boat, so that's a big problem, so they're not thinking straight. Their other mistake that they make, and you hear them talk about this, is that because they believe that because the yacht costs millions of yen, it's indestructible. And hence they're relying on the technology with them and not relying on any skill to operate it. So clearly there weren't enough skilled hands on board when this crisis hit, this storm. And immediately the morale begins to run low, and there's tension. We see this tension among the passengers. So that's usually the case in a survival situation. The morale can run low. That's why it's important in a survival situation not to let the morale run low. The yacht's auxiliary engine fails to start, and then we start to see certain members of our cast blame one another for this problem, and of course the owner blames the captain. Right, no one is wearing a life jacket. No one wears a life jacket during the whole movie, yet they're out on the open ocean. They're drinking a lot on this trip. The storm renders the yacht inoperable, and they're set adrift way off course with no working radio or radar. They have a transistor radio, but it begins to fade, the batteries go dead, and one member, the writer, becomes exhausted. He gets tangled up in wires, on the deck, and then he begins to hallucinate a bit later on. So this can happen with extreme fatigue, of course. They drift close enough to some unknown island where they swim to shore, and it's pretty clear now in the story that the outing was only intended as some kind of day trip, as they were completely unprepared. They were carrying literally no food and no water. They had lots of booze and cigarettes, of course. That's really going to help them. So that's basically their third mistake. However, the first mate brings a knife ashore with him. So that's the first scene you see of someone that has grabbed a knife and taken ashore with him. So the first thing they do when they get to the shore, the captain suggests that they should go looking for food and water in that order. And that's the advice of the captain, which you might expect, the captain being the leader in a situation, they should expect to find food, water, or water, food, and shelter. So interestingly, when they move from the beach, you see them framed between 2 pandanus palms as they leave the water's edge, Now, pandanus palms have edible parts on them, and they can also at certain times of the year produce edible fruits, but no more is seen of this. And I'm not sure whether or not the original idea here was that they had food, maybe the way I see it is that they had food right in front of their faces, and yet they failed to see it, and they went off. Anyway, that's just me thinking that there. So I think the writer-director wanted to say something here, that food can be right in front of your face, but you have to know about it, okay? So we see them try to eat random plants. They find, which, are inedible or they don't taste any good, They do find water, that's the next thing. They find a shipwreck, quite a large shipwreck, much bigger than their small yacht, and they take refuge in the shipwreck. And quickly upon the discovery of food in the ship, we see some other terrible things start to happen, some other things, and that is some party members decide to eat the food that they found without sharing it amongst the others, and that's obviously going to cause tension. That's a big problem. So deceit becomes the order of the day, and that's seen in everyone except the professor, the young university clerk, and the ship's captain. So things start to get nasty when the businessman refuses to help to find food or water, and there's also some sexual tension arises. So we've got some sexual tension arising here between three males and the singer, and that results in numerous fights and people hiding food from one another, knife fights, and people actually threatened with a rifle. They found a rifle on board the shipwreck. To make the situation worse, it is discovered that the island is full of hallucinogenic mushrooms that could be poisonous, and maybe why the crew of the shipwreck are nowhere to be found. Morale is very low. The captain tries to repair the yacht, and the businessman tries to bribe him to escape from everyone with the remaining food and supplies, for it appears the island is devoid of food. Is this possible? That could be possible, okay, if you're not prepared to go fishing. You don't see any attempts to go fishing. They have nothing to fish with anyway. So in reality, it's not like they, swam ashore and they took with them fishing rods. Okay, so they do all sit down and discuss what's got to be done in order for them to survive. In other words, to go out, collect food, to do this and to do that. But what we hear from one party member, and in my opinion it only takes one, and there's some negative views about their chances of survivability. And I think, it's really important not to these kinds of negative views, they can really creep in, and once they creep in, it's like a cancer, and you've got to nip these things in the bud straight away, because as soon as somebody starts spreading doubt, other people that are maybe on the edge of doubting, can start to doubt too, and it can be a big problem. It's mainly a problem of morale, keeping good morale, because once the morale is lost, then basically you are just going to become a liability. That's my experience. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Once you start saying everything is lost, you're really in trouble. You may as well seriously just give up. A writer friend, the businessman, is now juiced up on magic mushrooms and holds the remaining party members to gunpoint. Yes, they found a rifle, as I said, but only ever wasted bullets firing at targets they could not acquire. So that was another really poor thing that they did there. That was a bit stupid. He kills the first mate, but he's then overpowered by the professor and the businessman. The singer and the writer are banished from the group. More bullets are wasted by the businessman trying to shoot at the feet of the leading party members. The businessman wants to commit suicide now, so he's the person that's just basically given up on all of this. But the singer returns juiced up on mushrooms and lures him away to a similar fate. Okay, so that's the exit of the businessman there. Now we introduce the crazy part, monsters start to appear. Or is this what we're led to believe, or are they just figments of their imagination due to slow starvation and lack of morale? So the monsters attack the professor, and they manage to basically kidnap the clerk, as you would, and she later succumbs to the effects of the mushrooms. The professor manages to escape the monster's clutches on the brink of insanity and swims back out to the yacht and sails away with a partial sail, eventually to be found where he's been narrating the whole story locked up in a mental asylum in Tokyo. so in terms of survival, I could say my own personal experience is that in dire situations, people can turn upon one another and certainly become irrational. They can become irrational because, maybe through lack of water, usually lack of hope, they just want to sit down and not do anything. But if you're suffering through dehydration, you can actually become irrational. So it's not just about finding food and water, but it's controlling tensions and anxieties, which are really important. Reassurances, positive attitudes, and pitching in. These are important things to make sure you don't become a liability in a survival situation. They had many tools at their disposal, but used both probably unwisely. For example, the gun and the knife played no part in their survival, even if you count the professor's attempts to ward off the monsters. They were, of course, invulnerable to mere bullets and probably knives. All that aside, I think this latter point is key, as people today believe that the key survival tool is the knife and the gun, but here we see they aren't. The knife and the gun are pretty much useless in this situation. I think the biggest problems I see in this tale of survival is essentially we have a lot of deceitful behavior going on, so nobody is cooperating as a whole anymore. Also, some of the party, their downfall was getting eaten these hallucinogenic mushrooms, and that was the end of them. So we had fights over money, we had fights over, which I didn't show there, but they get into these hallucinogenic mushrooms, and that's like the equivalent of, that's sort of like has happened in reality. Burke and Wills, some famous explorers in the early days of Australia, they too did something really dumb. They started eating this plant called nardoo. They saw the Aboriginals eating it, they saw them making bread out of it, and they basically died with full stomachs because what they didn't do was they didn't pay enough attention, and they had to separate the husks from the inner starchy material of nardoo, and basically it was ripping all the vitamin B out of them, and they basically poisoned themselves. So, you have to be paying attention to what's going on, and it's really foolish just to be eating anything if you want to stay alive. You have to know what you're eating.